Okay, so we're in Romans chapter 13. We just read part of chapter 12, and I think it's important because a lot of times, again, we divide things up and they get fragmented, and so we don't keep the continuity of the flow. So the last part that he was talking about there, and if you want to go ahead, I'm going to get my Bible opened up. I see I'm not opened up in the right spot in Romans chapter 13. So the previous section that we were looking at in Romans is very legalistic in kind of the doctrine of salvation and God's plan and everything. But this section then becomes our life as a Christian and how we live a life as a Christian and our relationships. And the true marks of a Christian is what we were looking at last week. But he kind of transitions the end of chapter 12 in looking at the idea of our relationship with external. And like I divided that chapter up, the first part of chapter 12 really was about loving one another and the types of love that we have from within the church. And if we can't master that, we're not going to be able to really show it externally. We have to learn how to love one another. And it's already hard enough to love people outside that don't love us. So the idea of him saying about, bless those who persecute you, and back in 12:14, and don't curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Don't look and rejoice at those who are in sin and suffering. Just because they're not a Christian and they're suffering, we don't rejoice in that. Maybe, I have to say this sometimes, you know what? It's hard not to. It's hard not to. When you see some of the evil things that people do and then something tragic happens to them, I really have to struggle with that. But you see, what God's trying to do is make us like him. He does not rejoice when the sinner suffers, when somebody who's ungodly has some catastrophic event in their lives. He does not rejoice in that. And that enables him to be able to be receptive towards him and being able to show that love. And that's what we need to be able to do. If we're always looking towards the disasters of the world and sinful people, then we judge them and we put them at a distance. So that's kind of, I think, what, in a nutshell, he's doing there. The warning is the last verse there in 12 is talking about the idea that it's, don't be overcome by evil. You see, evil loves to triumph over everybody's hurt. It's selfish. And so it's very dangerous for us to get involved in that because that's the evilness that can overtake us and cause us to have problems. So now we get into this section here that, I remember here when I was growing up, there's two things you don't talk about. You don't talk about what? Politics and religion. And oh, wow, we're fixing to do both. Politics and religion. I didn't open that up. This is written by God through Paul, but it's an important aspect of our relationship. And I think that in our country lately, it's been even more difficult as Christians in trying to struggle with what do we follow? How are we submissive? And so I hope, I'm not going to try to pick a wound and make something politically insensitive or something like that, but I hope that you will evaluate what's going on in our society today and what we're faced with and look at the perspective of how we should be, our responsibilities. So let's go ahead and I'm going to read 1 through 7, and then we're going to come back and kind of take it a section at a time. So let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For the rulers are not a terror to do good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. So the first two verses right away is saying, let every person. Now, when we look at it's deeper than that I want to push this, because when the word there in the Greek is more of the soul. It's not just an individual, it's a deeper, richer association that he's talking about in that idea that we're subject to it. Now, there are throughout the whole Old Testament governments, and it started. And what I thought was fascinating was a verse that in Acts chapter 17, when Paul is talking in Areopagus and he's talking to the Greeks and all the great, educated minds of that day, it's kind of like the Harvard and the Princeton all rolled up into one place. And he's talking to them. He enlightens them with something in 17:3 and 4. And in 17:26, he says, for he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So where's the authority? Where does everything start from? Now that's kind of, I'm taking it out of context because that's not what Paul's necessarily pointing out here. What he's pointing out here is that we all come from the same source. But in that, it points to one thing. It points to that there is one that has true all authority, and that it's God who has established the nations and allowed them to be where they're at. So this takes it to a whole new level when we start to look at and break down our own individual relationships, because it is something that is challenged. But like I said, if you go back to Genesis, we start to see immediately that when God placed us in the garden and he created us, one of the very first things he started to establish is authority. And in that authority, he commanded man to do things. Now, I think what I struggle with is we're going through this, we have to think about the idea that we're not talking about the corruption, okay? We're not talking about sin. We're not talking about the evilness of government. We're talking about God's plan. It's kind of like looking at the plan that God has for the family, okay? Not the way that you see them 99% of the time. But this is what God's plan is, and that the importance of it. So let's try to keep that as we look at this. So, from the very beginning in Genesis 1:28, he blessed them and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion of the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves. Then he gave them the command. He gives man a command to go ahead and he says, I want you to name all the animals. So there automatically we have an organization. Govern. Govern means to manage, means to regulate, to prescribe something that you have been endowed with from a source of authority. And so that's the whole thing, source of authority. In my house, I had a government. There was a father, a mother, there were children, we had our relationships. When you look throughout the Genesis record, we don't have anything that pops up and says, and God established governments. But we find that every time it starts, especially with the patriarchs, you see within the families that there is an organization that honestly is a governance. It's a governance of the family by the patriarch. And so it's not something that is unusual. It's something natural that God has established by the fact that he created us and he's given us this world to, inhabit. Now the problem is, immediately once he gave us this beautiful organization and that simple governance, we sinned and we broke away. So now we have the complexities of governance, let's say the governing of whether it's the family or a tribe or a village or a city, state, nation, empire, is sin. Sin is the corruption that we find as we go along in there. And the responsibility, and I think one of the most, telling verses is when you go to Judges chapter 21, 25. And at the end of that book, it starts out with the same. It says, and in those days there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their eyes. What is that? That's chaos. That's total chaos. If you read about the moral values, the violence that was going on, it was complete chaos. So the opposite of government, the lack of government, is chaos. And we see that happening time and time again as we watch, even study our recent history, going back to 15th century and beyond. You can see where when you have this type of corruption within and a lack of governance, good governance, and a lack of control of the people, you have a collapse. One of them that I think of, or some of the modern ones, is like what happened in Egypt. We call it the Arab Spring in Libya. You know, and I'm not trying to judge a political motive or whatever happened, but when you watch, now, and trust me, these were evil, bad leaders, Gaddafi, but when it collapsed, it went into total chaos, violence, just beyond understanding. And so even with that, the irony, and Saddam Hussein even, when we look at some of these, we judge them and we go, wow, you know, we need to get rid of them. And our government has done, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, I think we've been kind of bad on, we just think somebody's bad on our standard, we remove them, and then we just see an implosion of that culture and the violence that comes about it. But that's what happens to a society whenever they have no king, when they have no ruling. So let's talk about the governance that God then tried to pattern. When we look at that, we see the model that he established was one that was exactly the same that he has tried to establish and initiate and hold up until sin came in the garden, was one in which there was no king because he was king. And if you notice that in the Mosaic Law, God could foresee that they were going to end up wanting a king, and so he puts some regulations in it about it. And when you choose a king, which is interesting because I'm surprised they didn't go, well, wait a minute, well, why don't we just choose one now? But Moses didn't allow it. They didn't have a king. They had a government organization that started out with God as king, then you have the high priest, and then you had the elders that would be at the city gates and such, and you had a structure. But the judges became corrupt, and you find that the priests were corrupt. And so eventually the people then looked around, and what did they see? They wanted a government like they saw other nations. And what were they doing? Well, they had a guy that was a king, somebody that was a figurehead, that was royal, and he just looked awesome, you know, and so the whole nation would rally around that one person, but see, that should have been God. And then he would provide a military for them. See, that was another thing that God said, you don't need a military, you got me. And so they started looking out, the children of Israel, and wanting to model their government after the nations around them. And so God led them. And how'd that go? Not well. It didn't do well. But it doesn't mean that you don't need governance, right? You need this. The problem I find when it comes to our relationship with any type of authority is we have this little bit of rebelliousness in us. We don't like to be told what to do. That's just a part that seems to be a corruption within us. You know, you want to get me to do something, tell me don't do it. Tell me I can't. Now, we see that in our kids, but honestly, adults still have that within us, that we don't like that. You know, I see that when it comes to the speed limit. Everybody's fine with the speed limit as long as, you know, until it affects me. You know, I'll run 70 or 80 or whatever speed limit I want. But now if you crash and do something dumb and ignorant, then I'm mad because you broke the law. So it seems to be, in other words, okay, law is good, government is good as long as I benefit. Right? As long as the laws make me happy, then I'm okay with it. So there's a rub, I think, right there with us being governed. And so that's why we see the teachings, even in Titus. We see where Paul in Titus says, in Titus 3, 1 and 2, he says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities. Be obedient. Be ready for every good work. To speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy towards all people. That's even the people in authority, to show that. And even we know Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 15. He says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And, you know, that's another one that's kind of hard for us to swallow because we judge what we see going on sometimes to our personal values, and we see that they're in a conflict, and so it's harder for us to do that. But he doesn't just say be submissive to all. He says for who? For the Lord's sake. God wants us to do that. Because again, like what he said in the very first couple of verses here that we looked at, he said, they have been established by God. And when you resist that, you're fighting against God. That's what's frightening. And I think that should be something that we should think about when we're challenged with submitting ourselves to governmental rules and things that are going on around us and being able to discern what it is. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go into that. But even over in Daniel, and Daniel I think is a great illustration of this, but even Daniel, in Daniel 2:21, he says he changes the time. He's talking about God. Daniel's talking about God. He changes the seasons and the times. Doesn't that sound like what we said in Acts 17? That God sets the boundaries and the times and everything. Here he's saying this again much earlier. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and he sets up kings. So a lot of times we look historically and you see somebody like Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar or Tiglath-Pileser, and they brutally kill their way through and rule, and that's what you think. Well, the most brutal gets to rule. The strong is the guy who ends up being on top. And it's interesting that I don't know how to reconcile some of these rulers that we have seen historically come into power. And one of the most recent historical one is Hitler, Stalin, Khmer Rouge. Some of these that come into power, and you look at them and you just kind of wonder, how does this fit? I don't know. But what I do know is he says we are to submit. We are to submit. And it's God who is going to raise them up and take them out, which we're going to talk to these rulers in just a second, because I think there's a very valuable lesson as well that we need to look at when we deal with that. So now he tells us in 3, and this is really continuation 3, for rulers cause no fear for good conduct, but for bad. Now that, again, that's the purpose of them. And most of the time, they are. Now, let's put it in a historical perspective of what was going on and what government were these Christians under. Well, they were under the Roman Empire. Yeah, you know, that was, and I grew up with this idea of how evil, horrid the Romans were. There was a lot of good things that the Roman Empire accomplished. There's things that we overlook in the uniting of it. Many historians have even brought up the fact that the timing of the gospel coming exactly when it did with the Roman Empire versus any other empire was perfect because of the ability of the gospel to transverse across the Mediterranean, across all these nations. If they would have been fragmented individual nations and such, it'd have been much harder. Language-wise, there was a common language. Everything was playing in. So the Roman government did have a role. And not every emperor or Caesar was evil. Selfish, yeah. Narcissistic, yeah. But hey, we've had some very good leaders in our nation, and they're narcissistic. They have a self, worth that's a little overinflated. But if you look at some of the Caesars that came along, there's Augustus, the first Caesar after the Caesar that was Julian Caesar, that was killed, and his son, adopted son, becomes Caesar and the longest ruling one. You know that he outlawed divorce. He saw divorce as destroying the family unit. There's a lot of things that we don't look at. We look at it from a Christian perspective and say, oh, they were just all evil. Not all the emperors either went after and just tried to slaughter, genocide Christians. They really didn't care less. There's a lot of things I'm trying to say that even though we look at the Roman Empire and this, but there were some terrible things that came up that they had to make choices on. Just like Daniel. Daniel never bent the knee to Nebuchadnezzar. Never. And that's what we find in the first century as well, is that Christians reached a point when they were forced to worship the emperors as gods that they refused. So there's absolutely a point when we look at where we're looking at, who we're worshiping, and who we're allowing to have that undue influence on us. And that's kind of the issue. There are some people who worship their politicians, but they don't understand. You know what? Where does it all come from? Who's the ultimate that we should be worshiping? It's God. It's God. And so when he talks about this, that we should understand the relationship of what God has intended for government and us. So he kind of asked this question. It's a rhetorical question. Do you not fear authority? There's a lot of people who don't. They don't fear it. And that's kind of what we see going on at times throughout our history of our nation where, the society didn't fear the law. And what happens? Chaos. My truck got stolen. My car's already been broken into. We see all sorts of things happening. And I know my neighborhoods, we look at the crime and things going on, like in Albuquerque. They hit a record peak of violence and such. And, do they really respect the law? The law is supposed to deter crime. Law is supposed to have a consequence to where it deters you from saying, I don't want to pay that price. A $3,000 fee for speeding 5 miles over the speed limit. You want to get caught? Can you pay $3,000 if you were caught speeding 5 miles over? Now I'm exaggerating, but think about it. It would stop everybody from speeding because the first $3,000 ticket they got, it would stop it. So there is some things that happen, but it's not God's fault that the government is not enforcing the justice. We see that in 2 Chronicles in 19:6 when God warns the judges there. And he said to the judges, consider what you do. For you judge not for man, but for the Lord. He is with you in giving judgment. Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be careful what you do. For there is no injustice with the Lord our God, or partiality or taking bribes. That's the warning I have for our leaders. The authority that you have does not come from a government. It comes from God. When we say we are, we the people for the people, but honestly, it comes from God. This is God's given us the ability to have this type of freedom. We have such a unique relationship as Christians, as a society with a government that has never existed in time. Never. A democracy, the closest it came was in Greece. And the democracy, they always looked at it as a failure. It would always collapse when you let the mass people participate. And so we, in a sense, having that ability to speak up and to have that voice is very unusual compared to many of the Christians' lives and nations that they lived on before that. And so, because he says as well, they are God's servant. I think it's kind of a reinforcing the idea that when we fight against the government, and as Peter even expanded that on institutions of authority, that we are fighting against God. And he says, honestly, if you're doing the right thing, you're not going to go around fearing the law. Many times Paul was able to use the law to stop things from happening, because he knew the law. You remember Ephesus when they're drugged before the magistrate. The law stopped them from just being able to just kill and beat them. We see that Paul was able to use his citizenship, the law, and say, I appeal to Caesar. And they respected that, and they shipped him up to, go stand before the emperor. So don't be afraid of government. They do bear the sword, and it's God's. And he says, it is God's servant to minister punishment on the person who is doing wrong. It's not yours. Now, that fits with what he just said about taking vengeance in your own hands. Vigilante. I don't know if you've done any historical studying of the 1800s out in the West, 1860s on, but there was no law. The Indian Territory across Oklahoma and New Mexico Territory in Arizona, if you got robbed, somebody got killed, people were taking it upon themselves. And then when the law started happening, you started having some law, it was hard because the people, you heard about it, lynchings happening. Many times there are stories about U.S. Marshals and Texas Rangers. They were having to rush the people out that needed to be tried because they just wanted to lynch them. And one of them is a horrific story about this one man, and because they were black, somebody got killed, and so they just started killing everybody. They just started, if you're black, they just started killing them. And so the marshals came in, and they got this man that was being accused, and they got him out of town, and the mob was chasing them on the train, trying to get the man and take the law in their own hands. They got him to San Antonio or Galveston, and they tried him and found out he was innocent. And see, that's where you see our nation was really growing in this anarchy where people taking vengeance, taking the law into their own hands. There's a lot of people, I'm sorry, I don't want them to try to determine what they think is right and wrong with my life. And so it's the one that we want. This is why we pray for the government. This is why we pray for our national leaders, so that they can have this. And also pray that they understand that this judgment and this guidance and leadership that they're doing is, they're going to be judged by God. God's going to hold them as accountable as well. And so he then says, therefore, because we understand the fact that they are appointed government institutions, are appointed by God, that these rulers are instruments and servants of God, because of that, then he says it's necessary to be in subjection. Not only because of the wrath of the authorities, so there's two parts here, look what he says, but also your conscience. Why your conscience? You know, you think about that, well, my conscience doesn't bother me. Well, yeah, it should. When you're breaking the law, there's something within us, honestly. Even when I'm speeding, you know, a lot of times it bothers me. It's kind of like something I worry about if I'm rolling or violating or things. It should bother us, in other words, that we're breaking the law. And mainly as Christians, because God has told us not to. God has told us that we should be. It's also historically fascinating to me that this letter, when it got out and read by the Roman leaders, they were stunned. Because here they were kind of suppressing and oppressing Christians, and then they got this letter, and the letter is telling Christians to submit to them. They'd never seen something like this, where you have this cult group of people who are so against and so odd in their values against the government, yet that cult group is saying, obey the government. And there's a lot of Roman historians saying that the best citizen in Rome was a Christian. And I think it's because, and look at the influence that you have. That's the power of it as well, is that when we're letting God handle this, it's a powerful influence of letting God take care of things, putting the trust. And plus, you know what? It relieves you a lot of anxiety. Let God judge the government and be at peace with all. And so also he says, not only because of the wrath that you can get, but also because really your conscience as a Christian, you need to think about that. And so then he gives examples, really. He's just giving examples. This is why you pay taxes, you know, this is why we have certain requirements that we have to do. We have to register our cars. If they had cars back then, he could have probably put that in there as well. You know, I see people who try to justify either getting out of it. Now, there's a difference. We have tax laws that say that if you have certain requirements, you know, some people could get away with certain deductions and maybe they never pay taxes. That's within the law. That's not saying you're getting away from it. But when somebody just flat out says, well, the government's corrupt and I'm not going to give them any of my money, no, now you're really walking a dangerous line of fighting against the government. And this is one of the things that I thought was beautiful, is in Mark 15:17, Jesus is asked about taxes. Remember that? And they bring a coin to him. Should your servants, should your disciples pay taxes? And he says, bring me a coin. Now, I'm really paraphrasing, but he knew that they were being hypocrites about this. And he looks at it and says, okay, well, whose face is on it? Well, the Caesar. All right, that's his. Then give it to him. But look what he says, though. In Mark 12:17, he says, Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. But this is the part we lighten up on and don't understand the importance of this. And to God the things that are God's. So what are the things that are God's? All souls. Us. Everything, honestly, is what we should. And so he put it kind of in a good perspective, I think. And so, continuing in verse 7, pay everyone what is owed to them. Do what is right. Taxes, if you owe taxes, you pay taxes. If you owe money to somebody, you pay that. But he goes further than that. He goes respect. You notice that's what he started out with, looking at the government, looking at people in authority. You know, there's a lot of presidents that over my lifetime I didn't like. But I have an amazing respect for the office of the presidency. I've loved studying the presidents and going back. There's just something about the whole office of the presidency and the function of it in the White House and all of those things. It's nostalgic. It's amazing to me. Even though there are some men in it that I don't, but it will always be Mr. President. I will give them that. They are still there. And it's hard. Trust me. I know it is. I know for a lot of people, depending on who's in and who's out, it's very hard. But leave that to God. You know, we have a certain way, but to get so ate up about it and angry about it, but we need to give respect, even though it may be very hard. It may be just be quiet. You know, that's what I've learned to do. Just be quiet about it. You can have your own personal opinion. Don't get me wrong. You can talk. God doesn't say you can't kind of grumble about it, but I think we have to be careful about it, because what does it lead to? It leads to anarchy. It leads to chaos, and that's where it becomes dangerous, that we have to be very careful with it. In Exodus 16:8, when they were given the Mosaic Law, one of the things that he talks about is this type of grumbling against the government. He warns them. He says, and Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and of the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're grumbling. You're not grumbling against us. You're grumbling against God. So what he's saying there, if you look at the Aaron and what they have is the Hebrew government that they kind of in the infancy, there at Sinai, there was a government in a sense, and they were working for God. And he says, you're not grumbling against us, because that's what they thought. Well, why are we out here? They'd go and complain to him. Why isn't there enough graves back home? Why isn't there meat back there? We're tired of eating this and that. He says, no, you don't understand. You're complaining against God. So if we look at the idea of authority, we have to be very careful, because he just said they work for him. They will be held accountable to him. Now, I also think because of the uniqueness of our relationship in this government in America, we have rights in our Constitution. And that doesn't, we don't lose those just because we're a Christian. We have right to freedom of speech. We have all those constitutional rights. So from a citizen point of view, we can stand up for those constitutional rights. It doesn't mean that we have to just submit and go, well, I have no rights. I can't complain against because somebody. No, we still have that. That's where other nations don't. We do have the right to stand up for our constitutional rights and things in which we have the privilege of as citizens, which is unique that, like I said, no other nations had before. So next week we'll move on, continuing this, looking at the Christian living and our relationship. and looking at fulfilling the law of love. He's moving quickly through these ideas of how we live. So if there's somebody with us this evening or somebody online that needs to evaluate or needs the presence of the church, needs help from us, especially focusing on your relationship, that's the most important. Do you have a relationship with Jesus Christ? Have you accepted him, not just confess, but have you taken action on your faith and become a Christian the way that we see that they became in the Bible? And that is, once they believed, they confessed, they repented, and then they were baptized for forgiveness of their sins. If there's something that we can do to help you establish that relationship or to encourage it and restore you, let us know while we sing this invitation song.
There's a great